My name is Armand Proulx. I'm pastor at Second Church, and I speak, however, on behalf of the First Church as well. We are co-hosting this event. Blessed be God for churches that have adequate parking. Our prayer on this day is that, this is the upper room, by the way, in case you didn't know. This is the upper room. And our prayer on this day is that we have ears to hear the wind and eyes to see the tongues of fire descending on each of us. So when it comes to the wind, however, we have this statement on the part of Jesus speaking to Nicodemus. You hear its sound, but you don't know where it came from or where it's going. There's a special wind blowing from off the coast of Maine in the shores of Eagle Island, and where Cynthia spends half of the year, I think, on Eagle Island, communing with nature and the ocean and with God, of course. And she boarded a flight on a wind going west, and that's why she's here today. And besides carrying her on bright wings, the wind also carried her many accomplishments and gifts. Episcopal priest, retreat leader, specialist in the restoration of the ancient teaching, medievalist. Did I get that right? And also a foremost leader in the centering prayer movement, founder of the Contemplative Society and the Aspen Wisdom School, and author of at least 7 books. And but I distill all of that in my own mind into one statement. She comes here for me, and I'm sure for all of you, as the inspired servant of God's wisdom, for which we have a deep thirst. So brothers and sisters, sisters and brothers, let us welcome Cynthia Bourgeault.
Good morning, everyone, north, south, east, west. I think it's a special pleasure to be here, and particularly hosted by Armand and Jean Proulx, this modest fellow who just so generously introduced me. You may not know, but I'm about to out you, Armand, is one of the people who is most intimately associated with the beginnings of centering prayer in its first movements from an in-monastic thing that began at the little monastic community of Spencer, about an hour away from here, back in 1975, how that moved to be a huge movement which has transformed the hearts and minds of Christianity over 30-some years now, and has grown into a major worldwide movement, one of the miracles of our time. But Armand was one of the first gatekeepers that was responsible with a small team that brought it out of the monastery and began to present it, first of all, to Roman Catholic religious superiors, and then from there to the world. And rumor has it that the name centering prayer may actually have come from Armand, although he doesn't admit to any direct recollection of this. But before that time, the prayer, because it had been modeled off of the 14th century spiritual classic, The Cloud of Unknowing, it was going by the name Prayer of the Cloud. And as people sort of said, well, that's not going to play in Peoria, It sounds sort of too fuzzy. So at a particular meeting, and many people recall through the use of Armand, it became centering prayer. by which we know it today. But there will be some new in this, because centering prayer itself, now about coming up on 40 years old, is 40 years old in its most recent revision. We're going to say that, of course, its roots go right back to, I believe, right to the heart of Jesus. But 40 years in its present rendition, and I think we're entering a new phase in our understanding of Christianity. It's a major transition phase logistically, because the people who first developed the prayer and brought it to us, the three blessed monks from Spencer, who took the heart of the Christian contemplative path and put it in a format that modern people could begin to use in the midst of their busy life to access the treasury of Christian mystical and transformational wisdom. Those people, one of them has now gone to meet his eternal reward. Thomas Keating, the great founder, is 88 and is in the process of trying to retire from this hungry nest of birds which he created. And William Miniger is still very much at work and active now at the monastery in Snowmass, but you can't possibly keep up with the demand. The organization which Thomas Keating brought into being, Contemplative Outreach, is in a new phase where it realizes that without Thomas Keating immediately micromanaging it, there has to be some way of preparing for a new generation. So that's very much on the agenda, a new generation of leaders, but I think even more interestingly, a development of the teaching. Because if there's anything that makes centering prayer reliable and authentic, it's its dynamism, its ability to bring about transformation. And it would be a little bit of an oxymoron, like a two-wheel tricycle, to say we have this prayer that is really based on dynamism, on transformation, on growth, and then to say that it's the same teaching that it was generating 30 years ago was going to be the same teaching, right down to the same words and the same teachings, the same hiccups, the same phrases for delivery. It's going to change if it's doing its work. And I think in a nutshell, this is what's going on so profoundly, that when centering prayer first hit the world as a membership movement, as a spiritual practice, the emphasis was rightly on personal healing. Thomas's very profound and influential teaching of the divine therapy, the healing of the false self, the moving ahead to begin to address the shadows and wounds of our personal life and to become more free and more generous in our relationship with God and with our neighbors. That was front and center. And a whole group of people, a whole generation of people grew up on that and took the practice seriously to heart, and their hearts were transformed. But along the way, some very interesting things happened. As that began to happen, we discovered the prophetic dimensions of centering prayer, and we're beginning to discover its participation in the birthing of a new level of consciousness, called by and large non-dual consciousness, which the Buddhists have been talking about forever, but which Christianity has actually had its authentic track on. But it's beginning to become the language that's so desperately needed in our planet, the language that heals divisions, that refuses to subject itself to polarizations, that sees beyond the form to the essence. And we're beginning to see that centering prayer because of its dynamism, because of the way it approaches meditation and transformation, has got some profound capacities to catalyze, midwife, stabilize a capacity for non-dual consciousness in its practitioners, and to send them forth as prophets of hope. And I think as we gather very much on the eve of the 10th anniversary of September 11, we begin to see in a profound perspective what challenge that threw at us and how badly we've actually stepped up to the plate of that challenge. That the need for the transformed heart, not more barricaded and frightened, but more open. The need for the unitive thinking that doesn't demonize brothers because they wear a different label. The ability to go into our hearts and hear and participate in a new that has yet to be born. These are skills which cannot happen when we're in the grip of fear. And the real prophetic work of centering prayer is to release us from fear, release us from hatred, and open our hearts to the capacity to be midwives of the new, which is ever coming. So we're in an area in which I predict a whole new generation of understanding is going to happen about centering prayer, a whole new generation of dynamism, a whole new generation of teachers and teachings that recognize this capacity of centering prayer to transform hearts and transform consciousnesses. So even if you've been practicing it for 35 years, even if you're an Armand and probably have the 40-year award, you're probably the only one in the room with the 40-year award. I checked in at 88, so I don't know what that is. The 30-year award may be coming up. Even so, we're in a whole new ball game. And it's the nature of the authentic things of God always to be creating whole new ball games. So, I want to then start at the beginning with what is centering prayer as a method of meditation. And I'm going to be working basically today off of my book, Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening, and particularly off the little bit at the very back called a summary, or I forget what it's called, epilogue, the way of the heart. And our theme today is actually centering prayer and the way of the heart. So what I'm going to do is basically be working my way through the first 7 out of 12 bullet points on this list. So if you have the book, you can go back and check it out. And if you don't have the book, the first 50 people, lucky people or so, can get one. They're right for sale on the book table there. But I'm going to be working them through rather indirectly. So that's the touchstone. And I'd like to start with the question of what is centering prayer as a method of meditation? What makes it like all methods of meditation, but what makes it unique? Well, all methods of meditation really have in common a goal of liberating us from what the Buddhists call monkey mind, from our enslavement to the compulsive nature of the mind that thinks us rather than we thinking it. You know, that isn't it funny? A thought pops into your head and all of a sudden you're off and running thinking it. You're here and you've come to a beautiful, retreat day, you've made an effort to do it, and all of a sudden something says, I wonder if that roundabout is still closed. I wonder if there's, and all of a sudden, whoosh, off you go thinking it. So meditation is to allow us, in the words of an esteemed former First Lady to just say no. When a thought comes up, to be able to bring some deeper level of our identity and presence to bear on it. And the tradition says that the good news is that beneath that fractured monkey mind self that most of us think is a self and spend so much of the time marching around enslaved to the marching orders of that compulsive thinking, beneath that is a self that is more stable, free, compassionate, and gentle, that is more in touch with the divine compassion and divine coherence that actually surrounds us in life. And most meditationists says it's just because of this kid with the boom box that is our monkey mind, that we can't hear and sink in to these deeper currents that are always there, enriching and sustaining our soul. So all meditation is about turning off the boom box, creating a little space so we are not constantly being tyrannized by our thinking and by the sense of selfhood that comes from our compulsive thinking. So whether you do meditation in a Buddhist tradition, a Christian tradition, an Islamic tradition, a Jewish tradition, a Hindu tradition, or no tradition at all, as simply a way of releasing stress, it is still going to have that goal. You're going to go through the eye of the window of saying, okay, maybe there's something here that's deeper than my thoughts. Let's see if I can find it. So that's what we have in common. And in the Christian tradition, there is a very strong stream of meditative practice that's been there from the start. But it's niched and generally packaged under the vocabulary contemplative prayer. Prayer without words, prayer without object, prayer without goal, prayer without words, prayer without words, prayer without agenda. And in centering in Christianity, what most of the world means by meditation, just describing it formally, we call contemplative prayer. And I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of why we do it, but I just want to tell you that functionally, the words are about 98% equivalent. So you can use them with confidence functionally to mean the same thing. And Christianity, if you look it up in the dictionary under the word contemplative prayer, you'll find that we do indeed have a rich, rich heritage of mastery in this practice for exactly the same reasons, to free us from the tyranny of monkey mind. Okay? But within that is the general goal. Meditation methods differ. And what is the challenge in centering prayer is really to forget most of what you've learned about meditation or think you know about meditation. That most methods will begin to teach you to get free of the tyranny of monkey mind by focusing on something. Concentrate your mind on your breathing or a mantra, or step back and witness. Watch thoughts as they come up. And stand back and say, oh, angry thinking, lustful thinking, frightened thinking. But centering prayer doesn't have you concentrate your mind on anything. It's not about paying attention to a mantra. It's not about following your breath. It's not about watching thoughts as they come and go. As a matter of fact, I think the best way to describe centering prayer is as a gesture. It simply is about this. It's about letting go. Letting go of those thoughts as they come up. Letting go of those attached places that we always get into by the very nature of our thoughts. One of the great stories about centering prayer that I'm really sort of disappointed never made it into the canon of things that are said at introductory workshops. I think it's the greatest centering prayer story there is the story of a nun. I think she'd been a high school principal or something in the Catholic school, very type A, and she tried this prayer, she sat down, and Thomas Keating was leading the workshop, and at the end of her first session, she says, "Oh, Father Thomas, I'm a total failure at this prayer. In 20 minutes, I'd had 10,000 thoughts." "Wonderful," says Thomas. 10,000 opportunities to return to God. Now, that's the method of centering prayer in a nutshell, and no one has ever said it better. In centering prayer, we're putting our effort not at stopping thoughts, at the nipping it in the bud, but every time we get caught on a thought and we let it go, we return to God. So the emphasis in centering prayer is entirely on the releasing end. We're not about, the thing with the focusing techniques is that they try in some way to prevent thoughts from arising or to detach immediately. In centering prayer, all we're really concerned with is releasing them as they come up. We give up from the start. Yes, thoughts are going to come up. It's the nature of our physiology. Very often thoughts will come up immediately. They emerge on an in-breath. There's nothing you can do about it. But the place where this practice does its work is in the letting go. And that is identified with returning to God. The words that they use for 35 years in centering prayer teaching to describe this release or returning to God is consenting to the presence and action of God. In other words, when I release a thought I'm thinking about, I'm essentially replicating Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane saying, "Not my will be done, O Lord, but thine." Or I let go of my stuff to make space for an unknown but mysteriously perceived divine presence. Okay, so that's what we're doing. It's a prayer of release. It's moving our mind essentially from a state like this, where we're hanging on to something, thinking it, or it's hanging on to us, thinking us, to a state of this. And it doesn't matter if you let go of a thought and 3 thoughts immediately rise up to take its place, because the work of this prayer is done in the release, the release, the release, the release. So that is the method, that's the intention of centering prayer in a nutshell. And the only real difficulty in doing this prayer is to value this gesture. How can that be prayer? You mean I'm just going to sit there for 20 minutes and just let thoughts come up and let them go? How can that have anything to do with my own beatific life? You mean that if I have a vision, that if God comes to me and says, "Look, I hear you, I'm going to sit down now and I'm going to tell you about this wound you've been carrying," and you say, "I let this thought go? Are you really going to do that?" It's counterintuitive. But what we're going to see as we actually work with this prayer is that, yes, that releasing, that movement from the state of being bound up, engaged, as they use in the language of the centering prayer with a thought, to the release, is itself a powerful action and a holy path. Okay? And we can demonstrate this theologically, and interestingly enough, we can now also demonstrate this neurologically, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later today. But this little gesture of moving from a state of thinking a thought, being bound up with it, to the releasing, is in and of itself a powerful spiritual action. And as we begin to learn to trust it and to entrust ourselves to it, it takes us a long way down a path where the fruits of our practice, our faithful practice, are experienced not so much by having wonderful visions and peaceful, tranquil times in the prayer period, but in our capacity to be compassionately present in life itself. In other words, it does its work mysteriously in the time of the prayer and profoundly in the action of our life. So that's the path of transformation you're actually embracing when you work with this method of meditation. There are parallel practices found in all the great spiritual traditions, but it has a particular affinity with the Christian spiritual milieu. It took me a long time to realize this, but one day it suddenly popped into my head. I think this was probably about at my 10-year point in my own practice of centering prayer, maybe even rounding the 15-year point. But all of a sudden, one day, what I realized was that the theological principle that centering prayer operates under is the principle of kenosis. Now, that's a word that may not be a common word to you in your Christian vocabulary, but it ought to be. You spell it Kenosis. And it comes from, it's a Greek word which means basically self-emptying. And the place it's grounded in the scripture, you'll find it in that famous hymn in Philippians 2, beginning in the 5th verse, where Paul says, you also should have in yourselves the mind of Christ. And then he goes on to describe it by means of an ancient hymn, probably the most ancient hymn in Christianity, that goes like this. You all know it, I'm sure. Though his state was that of God, his obviously being Christ, yet he did not deem equality with God something he should cling to, says Paul. Get the cling? In other words, Jesus didn't hang on, he didn't grab, he didn't say, hey, I'm the Son of God, I don't have to do this human stuff. Rather, it says in the next verse, he emptied himself. And that's the word kenosis in the Greek, from which kenosis says. Rather, he emptied himself, and assuming the state of a slave, was born in human likeness. He, being humbler, the translations vary and I get bummed, became humbler still, even to accepting death on the cross. So he emptied himself again. In other words, Johnny one note. All he could do is empty himself. But in the context of this passage, the meaning of emptying yourself is absolutely clear, isn't it? It doesn't mean making your mind a blank. What does it mean? What's it the opposite of? Anybody remember? Yeah, it's the opposite. He did not deem equality with God something he should cling to. Rather, he emptied himself. Okay? So functionally, kenosis is the opposite of clinging. Self-emptying in the Christian sense of the word is not some big fancy thing that's completely inaccessible, making your mind a blank, disappearing into God. It's nothing complicated like that. Functionally, it simply is the matter of letting go of what you're hanging on to. It's very, very close to what the Buddhists would call non-attachment. Okay? Letting go of that thing that you're clinging on to, not asserting your rights. You'll often find it garbed in Christian teaching with the word humility. But this word often sends us off on a wild goose chase too, because we think it means a kind of phony, pious self sort of putting yourself down. Humility simply means the freedom that comes from non-clinging. But we don't understand that in our teaching. But if you just remember that the Buddhists have this wonderful phrase, try to develop a mind that clings to nothing. And since it's the nature of our mind to cling to everything, the only way that you get a mind that clings to nothing is a mind that learns to unclench over and over and over and over. So we're going to look a little bit this afternoon about how really this is the core of the Jesus teaching. Over and over in his parables, in his discussions with the Pharisees, in his attempts to hammer it home to his dull-witted disciples. What part of non-clinging, non-entitlement do you not understand? How can the two of you be talking about who's going to be sitting at the right hand and the left hand of me in heaven when I have, So, centering prayer works under the theological auspices of kenosis or non-clinging. And that's very, very important to remember as you work at this practice. Because even if it didn't have a 2,000-year lineage behind it of actual Christian spiritual practice, even it had been invented out of the blue by those monks in Spencer, it still so completely and powerfully illumines the epicenter of Christian practice that it would be valid in its own right, in and of that. Yes, I need to speak louder, or, yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that heads up. So that's where it is. So in my first bullet point, I write this. As a method of meditation, centering prayer is founded on the gesture of surrender or letting go. And I encourage you to think of those two words as synonyms. Surrender doesn't mean capitulation. It means letting go of the thing you're hanging on to. The theological basis for this prayer lies in the principle of kenosis, Philippians 2, verse 6. Jesus' self-emptying love that forms the core of his own self-understanding and life practice. During the prayer time, surrender is practiced through the letting go of thoughts as they arise. Unlike other forms of meditation, neither focused awareness nor a steady witnessing practice is required. There is no need to follow the thoughts as they arise, merely to let them go promptly as soon as you realize you are engaged in thinking. A sacred word is typically used to facilitate this prompt response. So that's the theory of it. Now, for newcomers to the practice and for refreshers for old hands, this is how it actually works out. That what we do is, in centering prayer then, as Thomas Keating loves to say, intention is everything. Because this is a prayer that works with intention, not attention. We're not going to put our attention anywhere, because as soon as we put our attention on something, that becomes a thought, and we have to let it go. Okay? It's the nasty little catch-22 in centering prayer that you have to learn to work with. But it's done with intention, pure and simple, or as that 14th century classic, The Cloud of an Unknowing, calls it, our naked intent direct to God. And so our intention, without trying to hold it too closely, the ballpark is to be totally available to God, to the divine presence. If you don't like the God word, use a word you like. Totally available to the source, to reality, to the whole, to the unified field, to the ground, to the presence. Whatever word for you points in the direction of that greater reality that you sometimes actually touch and that you sort of trust you come from. Okay, so to be totally available to it, deeper than our thinking, deeper than our memory, deeper than our emotions, deeper than visions, deeper than that itch on your nose, deeper than the felt sense of I am here. I sort of say centering prayer is like reaching in your pockets and taking the keys to your BMW and saying to God, okay, go take it for a ride, and I don't need to know where you went. So the Sufis call this the seer, the great secret, where prayer goes on in the heart between God and the deepest part of our soul, without the snooping eyes of even our small self saying, what's happening here? We totally entrust ourselves to the refreshing flow from God to God, which takes place in our heart. We make space for that to happen, knowing in a deep and salvific way that that not only refreshes our being, but creates a place in which the great orbit of prayer can work in mysterious ways to touch our world, to bring comfort to those suffering from Hurricane Eileen, from floods, from disasters, from tragedy, from hatred. Our heart becomes a unoccupied, as it were, untended, unfortified altar on which the work of prayer can be offered in God's terms. So you make yourself available, okay? So that's the first thing you need to know about centering prayer. But if that's a great intention, we all know that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And you'll sit there with this high and lofty idea of wanting to make yourself totally available to God, and I guarantee you won't be 10 seconds into a prayer before a thought will arise. Something like, oh, I wonder how long this sit is. Maybe I should have gone to the bathroom before we started. Or, what's for lunch? Or, or, oh my goodness, I wonder if we'll get out in time to make it to the Cape before, thoughts come up. So what we do in centering prayer is we acknowledge that. We don't fight it. I give up. Thoughts are going to come up. But the way we put teeth in our intention is by a very simple thing, which I'm not ashamed to call a deal. And the deal in centering prayer is this. If you catch yourself thinking, you let the thought go, okay? Without recrimination, without inner commentary, without self-judgment, without regret, promptly you let the thought go. As it reads in the classic guidelines of centering prayer, when you become aware that you are engaged with thinking, you let the thought go. It actually says you use your sacred word to let the thought go, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's the idea. So the pattern of centering prayer is very much like that. There are, thoughts arise and you let them go. You let them go, you let them go. And if you catch that, that's basically what you do in centering prayer for the 20 minutes that the prayer goes on. But in centering prayer, there's one little bit of fine-tuning that we use. We will typically use what's called in centering prayer a sacred word to help, to assist in this prompt letting go motion. It helps basically to grease the skids of the letting go movement. And what we need to do to talk about the sacred word is to start by saying, It's not a mantra. It's not something you focus on. It's not your little prayer word. It's very akin to a little piece of red string tied around your finger that reminds you, sort of unconsciously, of something you set out to do. Remember that often when you have to remember to stop by the cleaner and pick up the dry cleaning on the way home, you know, if you put a little piece of red string around your finger or tie it on the steering wheel of the car, somehow, you look at it and you say, oh yeah, close. That's how the sacred word works. What basically happens is in a moment of theoretical lucidity, like right now, we say, yes, I'm going to do this silly deal. I'm going to try to sit for 20 minutes, letting go of my thoughts as a symbol of my willingness to consent to the presence and action of God, to make space, to allow this deepest interiority of my heart to be a space where prayer is offered. Okay? So, in this moment of lucidity, I pick a word or a short phrase that stands for my willingness to do this. The Cloud of Unknowing recommends a single syllable word. In the centering prayer teaching, it can be a word or a short phrase. A word like peace, or here, or shalom, or shalom, or Abba, or a short phrase like let go, or be here, or a two-syllable word like present, Abba, Amma, or even a very short, oh help. But whatever it is, it's a word that you choose that reminds you of your willingness to do this. And what happens really remarkably in the centering prayer practice is this. You pick this word. The only thing that you have to promise is you don't change your word during the course of a prayer period. Okay? Because obviously that would be thinking, am I getting all I can out of Jesus? Maybe I should shift to peace. But this little word, you know, you imprint it as the symbol of your willingness. So what happens is the teaching in centering prayer says, when you realize you have become engaged with a thought, you return to your sacred word as the sign of your willingness to consent to the presence and action of God. So it sounds like what happens in centering prayer is that you sit there, all of a sudden you come to, you realize you're thinking, oh, well, let's see if I can find that word, peace, and you use it to push the thought away. Actually, that's just a sort of time-lapse picture of what actually happens instantaneously. Because in this moment of theoretical lucidity and good intention, you've placed this word, you've begun to place it in your unconscious as the sign of your willingness to consent to the presence and action of God. What happens is it tends to come up simultaneously with your awareness that you're thinking. And so it'll already be there right at hand, reminding you, oh yes, I'm going to let go. So then it just gives you a little steady point to let go. So that's how centering prayer works. To walk you through the drill, in centering prayer, we sit either on a meditation stool or a meditation cushion or on an uncomfortable pew, or when you get home in a much more comfortable chair. Whatever way, it's a prayer that is done in the sitting form. And in a posture that comes as close as possible to relaxed but alert. Typically speaking, if you sing in a choir and you know good choir posture, that will be your very, very best posture to sit in centering prayer in. We try to make our body neutral so that limbs don't fall asleep, so that we don't fall asleep. If you sit back too relaxed, you will. The head resting lightly on the shoulders. Again, good choir posture. One thing I have to tell centering prayer people over and over and over again is try as much as possible to keep your head gently balanced on your shoulders, not slumped down or scrunched up. Slumped down, oh Lord, I am a sinner, or scrunched up, hi God, here I am, look at me. These are classic prayer attitudes of Christian spirituality. But when it comes to doing meditation, they're lethal, I meant to say. You will get a screaming headache, okay? I had one woman who, when she moved on to doing meditation, for an hour and a half a day, she had this classic, oh Lord, I am unworthy mode. And she says, why does the back of my head always have a headache? Well, duh, What we want to do is allow that free circulation of the spiritual energy, the chi of our being, to simply be able to move uninterrupted through our body, okay? So that's the goal. And as much as possible, as much as your body is capable of getting itself in that position, you're working with yourself, not against yourself. Typically, we close our eyes because while we're not afraid of thinking, we don't really want to encourage it. And so we want to, as gently as possible, discourage visual interference and withdraw into what Thomas Keating loves to call our inner room. But common sense rules, if you find you're falling asleep, bring your eyes to a soft focus and you'll come awake again, okay? And while there's nothing negative about falling asleep, nobody's going to sit there and wrap you with a Buddhist ruler. You might as well be awake. Typically, your hands are on your lap, face up or face down, doesn't matter which. Just let them be relaxed. If you're sitting in a pew or on a chair, please uncross your legs. If you're real short, you can put a couple of Bibles and prayer books and hymnals underneath your feet so your feet go out level. That's what prayer books and hymn books are for, Don't cross your legs, because cross circulation, unless you're actually sitting in lotus position, really gets in the ways of the free flow of energy in your body. So that's our sitting position. We start by closing our eyes and gently beginning to, quote, say our sacred word as a sign of our willingness to consent to the presence and action of God, i.e., let go of our thoughts as we realize we're thinking them. And so, the next phase in this prayer is kind of interesting and mysterious, and also very difficult to describe. That at some point in this prayer, your word will drop out, and your thoughts will drop out. And it just happens, rather like that moment when you fall asleep at night. You never see it, do you? All you know is that one moment you're sitting there running through the shopping list of what you're going to do the next day, and the next morning the alarm rings. How did that happen? In that same way, it will happen in centering prayer. You won't see the moment it happens. Don't look for it. Don't get caught in the trap of, oh, well, am I no longer thinking? Is it okay to drop the sacred word? This is given to you through the gift of your unconscious that participates in this prayer. So at some point, what will happen is that you will wake up and realize, oh, I'm thinking. What am I doing here, wondering about the recipe for cheese sauce or broccoli? Well, at that point, simply, probably the sacred word will be there already. If not, use it to let go of the thought. And typically, once you're up in that kind of more shallower level of an ruptured level, you'll have a lot of thoughts. And then the same thing will happen. The word will go out, the thoughts will drop out, and so on and on it goes for 20 minutes. When you are in periods of deep quiet, you won't be able to retrieve them with your conscious mind. When you're thinking, do the drill of letting the thoughts go as the sign of your willingness to do this, to consent to the presence and action of God, and simply let it be as best you can. In 20 minutes, after 20 minutes is over, the bell will ring, and we'll come back again. What the centering prayer guidelines then say, very, very kindly, is when the bell rings to signal the end of the prayer, don't just snap to alertness. Allow yourself some space to move from this more open, gentle, vulnerable consciousness of the prayer back into your daily thinking. They recommend a minute or two. If that feels long for you, okay, but don't snap. Gracious, gentle, gentle transition.